You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, Brian McClanahan here. We're back with the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Welcome aboard. This is episode number 15, and it covers February 22nd through 26, 2016. So we're excited to be back. When you're hearing this, we've already got our conference going on in Charleston, South Carolina, so the PC attack on the South, I'm sure we'll have information up on that after the conference is over, some of the lectures and other things. So if you went to that conference, thanks for coming out, and if you didn't get to go to the conference, we'll have more in the future, probably one over the summer. We've got a summer school coming up also, and then probably one in the fall on different topics. So think about coming on out to one of our conferences and supporting the Abbeville Institute. We'd love to see you out there. We'd also love your support to keep things like this podcast and the website going and other programs like the conferences that we would like to put on for you. And so we always appreciate any contribution you can give us. So this week is a great week at the Institute. We had a couple of pieces on U.S. presidents, considering that February 22nd is George Washington's birthday, and one leftover piece from Abraham Lincoln written by yours truly that we didn't have time to squeeze in last week, or space to squeeze in last week, I should say. So also this week we had a couple of really interesting pieces, one focusing on Antonin Scalia and his death and what that means for the U.S. Constitution, and one that was a philosophical piece by a philosopher, or amateur philosopher, I should say, or amateur historian, a man named Barry Clark, who submitted the piece for our review, and it was wonderful. So we had to include it on the website. And then, of course, always your Clyde Wilson, a weekly dose of Clyde Wilson. And so let's get started. The first piece was a little biography of George Washington. Of course, February 22nd being George Washington. Originally, this piece actually came from an 1847 book entitled Generals of the American Revolution. And William Gilmore Simms was a contributor, and originally the piece was put up under his name, but after talking with a great Simms scholar, Dr. Jeff Rogers, who said that no, Simms didn't write that piece. He wrote several of the chapters in the 2-volume work, but not the one on Washington. It was actually probably written by the main contributor to the book, Rufus Wilmot Griswold. He's a northern scholar, but liked Southerners. Now, didn't really care for Edgar Allan Poe. In fact, Griswold is considered to be Poe's character assassin, and the two of them had a lot of disputes, but he allowed Simms, who was considered to be one of the greatest scholars of the American Revolution, to write several of the chapters in this work on people like Sumter and Pinckney. So Simms did contribute, but it's just important to note, and what this particular piece does is explain George Washington and why he's important. Now, this chapter was much longer; it was about 60 pages, but we condensed, it took parts out of it for the Abbeville Institute and put it on our blog. So it is in the public domain. But this particular piece is on Washington's character, which is unquestionably the single most greatest trait that George Washington had. Now, we can talk about whether George Washington did some things in office as president that were dubious constitutionally, but there's no doubt that George Washington is the greatest American in American history. And it's become politically incorrect to say that, because Washington, of course, was a Southerner. He was reared in the Cavalier tradition. He was a slave owner, and so a lot of people like to criticize George Washington for that particular reason. But here we have a Northerner writing in the middle of the 19th century that recognized Washington for what he was, and that is the greatest American. We wouldn't have the United States. We wouldn't have America as we know it today without George Washington. And this is often lost in our drive to cleanse American history of anything that might be considered politically incorrect, or to replace certain figures in American history with others. Now, we should be talking about all of American history and people that made the fabric of America. But when you start taking people out to put others in, particularly when it's someone like George Washington, that's dangerous. And I used an example when I wrote my politically incorrect guide to the Founding Fathers. A couple of modern examples about George Washington. One is a textbook by a man named Goldfield, And the title of the textbook is The American Journey. And George Washington has very little text in this textbook. It's a college-level textbook, and George Washington is barely even mentioned. But of course, we have sections dedicated to American culture, and not very good American culture by that. Cultural history is great, but what they're doing there is talking about labor and the class conflict that people think saturated American history, and so we mitigate George Washington as a result. There was also a documentary done on the American presidents by the History Channel, and people focused on George Washington's acumen for designing uniforms and decorating Mount Vernon. They didn't really focus on George Washington's character or his status in Virginia, which at the time he was. In this period, people don't realize this, but George Washington was considered to be perhaps the greatest athlete in Virginia. There was a reason why he was chosen to lead the Continental Forces, not just because he was from Virginia, but because Washington was one of the greatest men of his generation, if not the greatest man of his generation. And so he was a natural leader, a man who exuded confidence, even though he was humble. You have to remember this is a man who gave up power willingly in 1783, resigned his commission when he could have been an American military despot. He could have taken control of the government and never let up. In 1783, we should commend him for that. Of course, also giving up power as president willingly after 2 terms. So, Washington, and of course this focuses on his time in the American War for Independence, but Washington's career outside of that is so great. And he embodies the American spirit, the conservative American spirit in that way. That's something else that George Washington had. He was conservative. Washington was not a radical revolutionary. He was looking at the war as a chance for independence, not to radically transform society. And that's something that Washington always strove to do, was to maintain the order that the Americans had under the British system, with modifications, of course, but he favored order. He wasn't going to allow for a radical French Revolution-style event to happen in America. And that in and of itself should be considered commendable, that Washington put the brakes on anything that could be considered that during his time as president. Now, we can look at a couple of events, and this piece doesn't get into that. So, the piece is up there to read. Washington is so good, everyone should read as much as they can about George Washington. But 2 things that Washington did, of course, that were unconstitutional as president, but one is his response to the Whiskey Rebellion, the other is the Neutrality Proclamation. Both were constitutionally dubious. Washington had no authority from the state of Pennsylvania to invade and put down the Whiskey Rebellion. In fact, the governor of Pennsylvania, Thomas Mifflin, was a member of the Philadelphia Convention, the ratifying conventions in Pennsylvania, and he knew well that Article 4, Section 4 said the president cannot invade. And we'll talk about this with the last piece of the week with Abraham Lincoln. But the Neutrality Proclamation, James Madison took Washington to task for this. The president cannot unilaterally declare neutrality. And so we often forget that. But, Washington still was a great man, even though he had these transgressions in office as president. But he still was the greatest man in American history. So it's good to read about George Washington. It used to be George Washington's birthday. Of course, Richard Nixon was behind changing George Washington's birthday to President's Day in 1973, so we can thank him for that. But Washington is the quintessential American, and he was the quintessential Southerner, and everyone knew that too. Washington wouldn't have been who he was without being from Virginia and being from Cavalier culture. And so if anything that we can remember in the South about Washington, he was a Southerner. And this is why people like Douglas Southall Freeman, who wrote the great and definitive biography of Robert E. Lee, also wrote a very good biography of George Washington, because the two were intertwined. You can't get around Lee without understanding Washington, and you can't understand Washington without looking at how Lee conducted himself in the 1860s and before as a man. The two were in so many ways, not just through marriage, but through character, entwined in American history. So we need to understand George Washington, and that is why we published a nice little biography, very complex, biography of George Washington on February 22nd, his birthday, which was Monday. So moving forward, the next piece we had for the week was written by Barry Clark, and the title of the piece, great title, is Manifesto of Old Men and Simple Preachers. And This is a little piece of philosophy. It's a discussion of progress and thought. And one of the things we have to understand about civilization requires thought. Being civilized requires constant being and thinking. It's not reactionary in that somebody does something and you react to them without thinking. It requires a tremendous amount of thought. And this is something that people don't often realize. But in order to be a civilized man, in order to be a cultured man, you have to think before you act. And so often today we just act. And that's not being a man. That's essentially a child reaction to something. It's reacting in an emotional way. This is what children do. But men who are cultured and civilized don't do that. They react in a thoughtful way to life's problems, to the things that confront them. And so that requires a tremendous amount of effort. And that's something that men aren't often taught today, is to think before you act. I mean, it's often been said, well, your mother told you to think before you act. But most people don't do that anymore, which is why we have so many people running around doing heinous and terrible things, uncivilized things. And so Barry Clark, who, again, is he's in the U.S. Army. He attended the Citadel, has a master's degree in military history, but he's a philosopher in so many ways. And this little piece is just so interesting for that. He starts with a wonderful paragraph. Over time, a man, if he is perceptive, comes to certain conclusions. The most startling is that the greatest truths were spoken to him throughout his life by ordinary men, simple preachers, old men sitting around drinking soda and eating peanuts, his father. These men, beneficiaries of a culture and community that embraces common sense as a virtue, know truths that philosophers for centuries have tried in various ways to express. Common sense is something all men should know. Common sense informs us of certain natural laws. Common sense is God's gift of understanding. And so then he goes on to talk about progressivism and how this has changed the way people think about things, secularism, utilitarianism, and how this modern Americanism is different from common sense and what we've been taught by simple preachers and old men. And he uses I'll Take My Stand, which, again, is a wonderful book. If you haven't had a chance to ever read that, by 12 Southerners, he uses this as a justification for his positions, and I would highly recommend reading that too. But in this, he quotes I'll Take My Stand several times as a common sense approach to American society, and how what the agrarians were preaching was simply culture and community. If we have a culture and community, that can help us create an anchor for which we can govern our lives, and an anchor for which we can make proper decisions. It is common sense, essentially. And his conclusion is great. And again, he cites I'll Take My Stand. He says this from I'll Take My Stand. For in conclusion, this much is clear. If a community or a section or a race or an age is groaning under industrialism and well aware that it is an evil dispensation, it must find the way to throw it off. To think that this cannot be done is pusillanimous. And if the whole community, section, race, or age thinks it cannot be done, then it has simply lost its political genius and doomed itself to impotence. So this is an agrarian. Clark is also looking at this from an agrarian standpoint as well. Community coming out of the agrarian critique of modern industrial society is something that the South is part of the Southern tradition, and people have taken this and run with it in other parts of the country. I think in the South we've forgotten this at times. But if you look at the Greens, who are so active in California, and even in the South, you have the organic farmers and people who are looking at community and faith. You have many of these people who are trying to break away from this modern industrial consumer society. And that critique is very Southern. And I think we forget that oftentimes. That is what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. It's part of it. The political tradition is also part of it, the Jeffersonian political tradition. But this idea of community and faith and small is beautiful, that is Southern. It has been Southern longer than anywhere else. The South held on to that idea longer than anywhere else in America. And so Clark is simply illustrating that in his critique of modern society. He even critiques the modern church, where you have PowerPoint presentations and modern rock songs and mainstream ideas are now saturating the church, secular mainstream ideas. This is just not common sense. This is not tradition. And tradition is what holds the glue that holds things together. We've long known that, and this is why tradition is under assault in America. So Clark does a very good job with this, and it's a well written and argued piece in defense of the Southern agrarian tradition by what we would consider to be an amateur philosopher or historian, but usually they do the best work. As I mentioned, Clyde Wilson has mentioned as well on several pieces. The amateurs do a good job of this stuff. We can't always rely on the professionals to say the right things and do the right things, because oftentimes they have been taught in schools that are the antithesis of the American tradition. So on Wednesday, we had another installment, part 26 of Sayings by or for Southerners by Clyde Wilson. One very interesting piece that people focus on, and they don't like this individual, and I agree, I don't like this individual either. It's Lyndon Johnson, and one of the worst presidents in American history for his blatant abuse of executive power. But he did say something very interesting at one point, and this is his quote. "I did not believe more than I ever had that the nation would unite indefinitely behind any Southerner. One reason the country could not rally behind a Southern president, I was convinced, was that the metropolitan press of the Eastern Seaboard would never permit it. My experience in office had confirmed this reaction. I was not thinking just of the derisive articles about my style, my clothes, my manner, my accent, and my family, although I admit I received enough of that kind of treatment in my first few months as president to last a lifetime. I was also thinking of a more deep-seated and far-reaching attitude, a disdain for the South that seems to be woven into the fabric of Northern experience. This is a subject that deserves a more profound explanation than I can give it here, a subject that has never been sufficiently examined." So David Crockett recognized this when he went to Congress and people made fun of him. And so Johnson goes to the executive office and people make fun of him. I think that when Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976, he brought that Southern folksy way to the executive office, and Carter is considered to be one of the worst presidents. I think some of that is because he's looked at as a hayseed. I mean, look at his brother, Billy Carter. He was a laughingstock of America. Same thing with Bill Clinton, even when Bill Clinton was in office. And again, Carter and Clinton are bad presidents for many reasons. But, Clinton was the Bubba. And even today, when you have this Trump phenomenon, I heard the other day in the Glenn Beck program, people are talking about the Bubba effect with Donald Trump and how these ignorant hayseeds are out there voting for Donald Trump. This is the Bubba effect, they call it. And so, Trump, of course, is not a Southerner, but there's this disdain for the South and people, working-class people, blue-collar people, people that don't care for the Eastern establishment or the highly intellectual individuals who should be telling us what we need to be doing of the New England school. Yes, and I think people like the William Buckley and these individuals who are so bright and intelligent, and they need to tell us what we need to think. And people like the bow-tied George Will, who was the high-minded intellectuals of American conservatism. This is just completely preposterous. I mean, people know what they want, and they don't want the northeastern experience. They don't want the establishment, and the establishment is the North. I mean, that's what's being attacked now by people like Donald Trump. Even Ted Cruz is anti-establishment. This is the critique that's coming at people, and they don't understand it, and they're calling it the Bubba effect. I mean, this is one reason why Jimmy Carter was propelled into office, because he was an outsider. Same thing even with Bill Clinton. I mean, Clinton considered himself to be an outsider, this new Democrat, somebody that was different. Now, he wasn't. I mean, he was obviously the establishment, but and the way he governed was obviously the establishment, but that was part of their allure, is that they were outsiders. They weren't somebody that had been in the Northeast. They weren't somebody that was part of the establishment. And so this is what Johnson is talking about here. And he's saying, that the South is always going to be considered the evil other. It's always the antithesis of, everybody thinks it's the antithesis of what really is American, which is the complete opposite of the truth. And that's one thing that if we're going to talk about the South, we need to hammer home. What is it about the South that is important? And it is the American tradition. And what is about the South that we should be exploring and being proponents of that's true and valuable? And it's the political tradition. There's so much in Southern culture that's valuable. The agrarian tradition, this critique of modern society that I think a lot of people would grab onto and run with if they had the chance and they knew where it came from. We spend far too much of our time talking about things that are gone in the South and that are unimportant, really, and defending things that are, in so many ways are unimportant, or at least not really defending them, but discussing them. What really needs to happen is that we need to export what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, and that's the political tradition, the culture of the South. It's a critique of modern society, and if we can do that well, people will gravitate to it. Young people, old people, people that realize there's something broken in America. This is what Bernie Sanders, there's something broken in America, and it's the American industrial state capitalist system, and that's true. I mean, this is not the Southern tradition to have that. The Southern tradition is a valuable critique, but it's a conservative critique, not a Marxist critique of this. It's a conservative critique of what Bernie Sanders is tapping into and what Donald Trump is tapping into. It's an alternative, a conservative alternative to socialism, but still recognizing that there are problems. There's something is broken in America. It's the political system that's broken because the Northerners centralized everything. And it's the cultural system that's broken because the Northerners centralized everything. And it's the financial system that's broken because the Northerners centralized everything. So it's centralization that's the ultimate problem. The move to get more organic food and other things. I mean, this is all very much tied into the Southern tradition. And then, of course, so this is a great, great quote, and ties back into the Manifesto of Old Men and Simple Preachers. And then on Thursday, we had a piece by Carl Jones. Carl Jones is, again, another amateur historian, a man that just very much interested in Southern history and in the Southern tradition, the political tradition in particular. And he talks about Antonin Scalia. And this is something that people have pointed out. What does Antonin Scalia's death mean to the Constitution? And people are having a heart attack over this, literally. I mean, oh my gosh, if we don't get another Scalia on the bench, we're doomed. We're doomed. And why is that? Why is it that we're doomed? Well, we're doomed because people have put far too much faith in the Supreme Court, and the Constitution has been distorted over time, and the court has become the final say on what the Constitution means. This is dangerous. As Carl points out, this is not what, as he says, this is not what the founders intended. And it's not what the Constitution allows. Now, you can say that judicial review was openly discussed in the Philadelphia Convention, and generally the delegates from states that had this type of system were in favor of it, and those who didn't were not. And so it was never really settled. Should the Supreme Court decide on the constitutionality of American law? Well, even in the Virginia Convention, it was said by Patrick Henry that he hoped it would decide. He hoped it would serve as a check on unconstitutional legislation. We've seen it doesn't always work that way. But what we've done over time is placed the Supreme Court at the center of every political decision, many decisions that should be made by the states. And so that comes down to incorporation, the 14th Amendment, and the fact that the Supreme Court, and also the Judiciary Act, which allows direct appeal to the federal court system, that should be state decisions. And so all of this stuff is problematic. And this is simply what, Antonin Scalia's death means, that now we have a situation where by one vote we're deciding on things that should be decided in the states or among the people of the states, and not by 9 unelected judges. So this is why this is so important. We shouldn't even be worrying about replacing Antonin Scalia, because if the Supreme Court remained within its defined powers and didn't go beyond those, which of course Jefferson clearly said was going to wear down the Constitution, they can, as he said, they can twist and shape it in any form they may please. Now we have a situation where these federal judges have way too much power, and we put too much faith in them. It needs to come back to the states, and the states need to decide what the Constitution says and means, not the federal government. And that was actually the way the founding generation Many of them, in fact not the majority, said it would be done. I mean, Roger Sherman actually said in Connecticut the federal government, or the states would be powerful enough to check federal usurpations of power. And that's what we need to remember. So this little piece by Carl is just so good because it gets into that particular idea about Scalia, and the importance of Scalia really shouldn't be important. I mean, Scalia was the most conservative justice on the bench, the one who was most interested in originalism, though he didn't make the right decision all the time. But he was most interested in it, and it'd be good to have somebody like that on the bench. But ultimately, if we had a proper federal system where the state still had a tremendous amount of control and power, this wouldn't even be a question. This wouldn't even be necessary to make sure we get another Scalia on the bench. So when you put all your faith in the Supreme Court, you're bound to be disappointed. And that's what's going to happen, even looking forward probably. That's what's going to happen. All right, so last but not least, we had a piece on Friday entitled Rethinking Lincoln. And I wrote this as a summary of why Abraham Lincoln is considered one of the presidents who screwed up America. In my book, 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America and 4 Who Tried to Save Her, Lincoln has been the primary focus of virtually every interview I've done on the book. Well, how can you say Lincoln screwed up America? Well, because he destroyed the Constitution. And this stuff is well known, and we talked about this last week. But even mainstream academics are starting to come out and say, well, wait a second here. There is something to this idea that Lincoln, destroyed the Constitution. There's a book written by Jennifer Weber entitled Copperheads, and I've linked a YouTube video to a little seminar given on Lincoln and his abuse of constitutional power, his abuse of the Constitution. These aren't Tom DiLorenzo. These are mainstream academics who are coming out and saying, well, I mean, Lincoln did abuse power in office. He did destroy the Constitution. And these opponents of Lincoln were prescient than what we've ever considered. I mean, so when you look at the abuse of war powers today, this goes right back to Abraham Lincoln. And this is something that he should be held accountable for. As we've talked about the abuse of war powers under George W. Bush or Barack Obama, it's Abraham Lincoln who was really the pioneer in that in American history. Now, I mentioned George Washington's abuse of Article 4, Section 4. Lincoln did the same thing by invading the states. If he says the states are in a state of rebellion or insurrection against the general government, well, then he has to have permission from those states to send in the army or call the militia to put down the insurrection. He didn't have that. The state of South Carolina never asked Abraham Lincoln to march the army into the state, and this is exactly why Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded from the Union, because they weren't going to allow Lincoln to violate the Constitution. They were going to defend the Constitution. And so those states had already rejected secession, but when Lincoln said, all right, I'm calling up troops to put down this rebellion or insurrection, he didn't have the authority to do so under the Constitution. And that's something that people don't often realize. He did not have it. He didn't have a declaration of war. Treason, according to the Constitution, is waging war against them, which is the states. And so we have to hold Lincoln accountable for these things. He also unilaterally suspended habeas corpus, which is illegal. And even though Edward Bates, who was the Attorney General, said, well, this is perfectly legal, people called him out for that. And he said, there's no way. And we talked about that last week with the James Byard piece, Executive Usurpation. And, of course, even Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation wasn't constitutional. Benjamin Robbins Curtis, who was a former Supreme Court justice, an abolitionist from Massachusetts, said, you can't do this. The justification you're using to best subdue the enemy is unconstitutional because this is going to open a Pandora's box. And Lincoln responded, he said, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy in time of war, I suppose I have a right to take any measure which may best subdue the enemy. Well, you can say this about anything. Best subduing the enemy could be ripping up the Constitution and starting over. And we saw that when we got to World War I and World War II and the Cold War and the War on Terror. So Bush, the legacy, Bush was simply following the Lincoln legacy, and Obama is simply following the Lincoln legacy. So if we're going to hold people accountable, we need to hold people like Honest Abe accountable for their glaring destruction of the Constitution. We can't just go out and criticize Obama, who's been bad, or Bush, who was bad, but we have to criticize other people like Lincoln and even George Washington when you have to call people out for abusing executive power. So all of these things, as we look forward and we move forward in our discussion of all these things that are the Southern tradition, what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, all these things are important. All these things are part of what we need to explore in what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And I think we should take some time thinking about, as we go out in our daily lives and talk to people about the South and talk to people about why the Southern tradition is important, you should bring up, it's the agrarian tradition, it's the political tradition, the Jeffersonian tradition. Lincoln was violating that. He was anti-Jeffersonian in his approach to the South, absolutely. So we need to think about that, and as we discuss things with our friends, learn how to export the Southern tradition. Learn how to speak about it in a way that will take the best of it and bring it forward into modern America, because that's what we need to be doing. The best of the Southern tradition. The things that are important, a positive message about the South and how the South is important in its defense of real America, whether it's theological, or whether it's economics, whether it's political. What about the South what can the South teach modern America? And that's what we're trying to do here at the Institute. So the Southern tradition taught us that Lincoln was a despot. The Southern tradition teaches us that the modern state capitalist system is broken and that we need to be looking for community and faith. The Southern tradition teaches us that a man like George Washington is a real American hero. The Southern tradition teaches us that Antonin Scalia's appointment to the bench should be irrelevant. All these things that we talk about, that we critique, and we say, my gosh, if it was just this way. Well, the South and the Southern tradition gives us the lamp, as Patrick Henry said, the lamp of experience in how to guide ourselves in our daily lives, if we would just follow it. But that's the important thing we need to get out of it. Until next time, good day.